Hi, this is Paul. I haven't made a monologue video for a little while. Been busy with all sorts of things. You might notice hopefully a little better quality in the video, quality in the picture. I'm using some different equipment to capture the sound, hoping that I can sort of avoid a lot of the sound issues that I've had in past videos. I want to talk today about something that's been in the scandal sheets in People magazine. Jerry Falwell Jr. Why does everyone hate Jerry? Now, he was sort of a hero to one group. He wasn't necessarily terribly loved by other groups. He was, during his period of time at Liberty University, my understanding is that it grew quite a bit. He's not a pastor. He's not an educator. He's a businessman and a lawyer. His father obviously was another controversial figure who in many ways was one of the prominent leaders of the 1980s moral majority movement. Jerry Falwell Jr. was controversial for a whole number of reasons. His involvement in politics, his fairly early endorsement of Donald Trump, his picture of posing, Jerry Falwell Jr. and his wife posing with Donald Trump, his stand on gun control, bragging about wearing a holstered gun when he led convocations at Liberty University. So he was a very controversial figure. And then there was the pants unzipped episode, that picture. And then there was before there was the scandal about what's the deal with this pool boy and some money. And then it all sort of broke open, and it was disclosed by the young man that this young man and Jerry Falwell Jr.'s wife had a relationship over a number of years, and all Jerry Falwell Jr. knew about it, watched, all this kind of really sordid stuff. And so then he has a fall from Liberty University and is forced to resign. And how is it received? Well, he was sort of a hero, but since his fall, everybody feels free to dump on him. Probably nobody who watches this video knows him personally. A few might have associations with Liberty, but apart from a signature on diploma, I don't know how many will have a lot of thoughts about him or concerns about him. My interest in this is, why do we care? Well, I think conservative Christians, evangelicals, care for a lot of reasons. The reasons have everything to do with symbolism. I was watching ContraPoints make a video on justice. I found it to be a fascinating video on a lot of different levels. The reason the Jerry Falwell Jr. case catches prominent national attention is because it plays on this symbolic, archetypal, liturgical, narrative drama layer. And as I've made videos and been thinking about this video's been sort of in gestation for 2 weeks. I just simply haven't had time to make it. But there's all sorts of things going on here in this story. Why do people care whether Jerry Falwell Jr. likes to watch his wife have sexual relations with a pool boy? Well, they care because Christianity has promoted a certain vision of sexuality, and by his failure to live up to that vision, in a sense, as that vision is being contested prominently in the world, what it says to the world is, see, he can't live up to it. That vision doesn't satisfy. That vision of sexuality is deficient. It's archaic. It should be set aside. And this is a point that's been made in the culture for at least since the 60s. So we're going on 50 plus years. People have been making this point. And so when he falls, those who are sort of on team traditional sexuality experience a shaming event, and others experience an I told you so. And it has everything to do with symbolism. So this ContraPoints video sort of kicks off with a Marvel comic book figure, the publisher, and apparently some police department someplace used that image and put it on their police cars, and ContraPoints finds this disturbing and problematic for some reasons, agree or disagree. I don't know that it's an appropriate symbol for police cars. Yet, why do we care? because it's the symbolism. It's the same thing with flag burning. It's these public symbols really do matter. So which symbolic cultural liturgy violations did Falwell compromise? Well, here is a culture warrior exposed to be a hypocrite. Okay. A Christian mogul who has to step down for moral failure. Not a new story. Falwell perhaps is a victim of patriarchal heteronormativity. That's a mouthful. Makes Liberty University an ironic name. The irony with the way this conversation unfolds is that what's happening with those who have been people who have complained that traditional Christian sexual morality is unworkable, unachievable, unhealthy. When you use that word unhealthy, you sort of implicitly assume that whatever standard you promote is the picture of health. And so always using healthy kind of begs the question with a medical moral frame. The difficulty with people who basically say that traditional sexuality should be laid aside is that when pressed, they find it awfully hard to lay down some clear lines that their side might agree with. Well, if you really love somebody. See, the Christian sexual standard is fairly well known. Christian sexual activity should be confined to marriage. That's the standard, and it's been that standard for a while. It's been an aspirational standard. Christians regularly don't live up to it, but to a certain degree, that's what standards are for. They're something that we aspire to. They're something that we reach towards. They're something that we try to live up to because we have agreements that this is the ideal for what we want our community to live. And Jerry Falwell Jr., as the president of a Christian college, and this is a strange case, of course, his wife was the one having intercourse with this young man over a period of 6 or 7 years, apparently, and Falwell liked to watch. And so how we think about this thing has everything to do with how we think about sexuality and how we think about norms. One of the interesting things you can do with this situation is to ask what background, what implicit background or assumptions do you bring to the story? Let's say you bring a traditional Christian sexual ethic. How then is this story interpreted? Well, Jerry Falwell Jr., because his wife is not the president of the university, this young man is not the president of the university. He is the president of the university. He's the one who lost his job. But if you believe or wish to promote a traditional Christian sexual ethic, then, well, Jerry Falwell Jr. is straight, ought to be possessive about his wife, and so he's either weak or a perv. And you will find many conservative Christians denouncing him, complaining about him, writing think pieces about him along that line. He's weak, or he's a perv. That's the point from that perspective. What's interesting from the other side, those who have really enjoyed his fall, probably partly because of his association with Donald Trump, and so then this just becomes political fodder, or because they want to basically discount or denounce a traditional Christian sexual ethic. Well, actually, their denunciations are a little bit more complicated, because if we sort of employ some standpoint epistemology here, what is the secret, sacred sexual self of Jerry Falwell Jr. that would lead to this kind of sexual activity? Perhaps he's a kink. Perhaps his secret, sacred self determines his needs, and so the strict Christian upbringing that he was subjected to by his high status, prominent father repressed his secret, sacred sexual self. And so he had to step out and do this in the closet. And so he and his wife and this young man apparently, and this is often the reason these kinds of relationships fall apart. It's because the young man would actually like a future. The young man would actually, somewhere deep inside him, even if he isn't a Christian or doesn't formally subscribe to a traditional Christian sexual ethic, somewhere in his mind probably there's a feeling like he'd like to marry and have a committed relationship. And whether you're a man or a woman, being the third wheel in a married relationship, is she going to leave Jerry Falwell Jr. to marry him? Probably not. Nobody in that situation wants that. But he at some point likely wants to move on, wants to have a better, more full-rounded relationship with a woman. And so apparently Jerry Falwell Jr.'s wife was jealous about his dating other women, and according to one report, Jerry Falwell Jr. chided him, "Don't make my wife jealous." But, you know, it's almost a trope where you've got the married man hooking up with the younger mistress, and the younger mistress keeps wringing her hands. He keeps saying he's going to leave her for me, and he never does. And everybody else in the room says, no, he's not going to, because marriage is a full-orbed relationship. There's this great line in, I think it was the second season of Mindhunters, which is a really terrific Netflix show on sort of the emergence of the FBI hunting serial killers. And the older of the two detectives says to the younger detective, the older is a married man and there's issues in his marriage and they adopt a child and the child is troubled and the younger man is sort of trying to figure out his path going forward. And the older man makes a comment. He said, you know, marriage is it's a lot of different things pulled together. It's part small business arrangement. It's not simply a sexual relationship. It's not simply a relationship for companionship. It's not even simply a relationship about money or children or parenting. It's all of those things combined. And there's a reason that the aspirational, traditional Christian sexual ethic has been so enduring, in that while people might say, yeah, there might be problems emotionally, people change, there might be problems sexually, there might be problems familially, there might be problems in all sorts of ways. Part of the reason it endures as a standard is because it needs to work, and in fact does work, often not perfectly, often with a tremendous amount of struggle, on all of these different layers. And so Mrs. Jerry Falwell Jr. is not going to leave her high-status, wealthy husband for this young, good-looking pool boy. It's just not going to happen. But neither is the young, good-looking pool boy going to not want to play the field with younger women and maybe at some point aspire to getting into a more fully formed, rounded relationship with a younger woman or a younger man. There doesn't seem to be any question about his sexual orientation, although somewhere in the back of my mind he was creating some site for gay men, so I don't know the situation, of course. I don't know any of these people. But this leads to the point of, if you have an anthropology that basically says each of us has some secret, sacred self that sort of gets manifest sexually as a sexual identity, well, you've got all sorts of problems with that sort of perspective. It sort of casts a blind eye to the idea that our sexuality is part of the formation that we have. Our sexuality is part of the, I'm sure there's a genetic component to it. We don't even know what all is going on in that. And so this secret, sacred self is sort of a symbolic, archetypal, narrative, liturgical, storified way of capturing what we think human sexuality is. And the secret, sacred, sexual self has played a big part in many of the conversations over the last 50 years with respect to sexuality. The gay born that way conversation in some way lends itself to this. And so in the situation of Jerry Falwell Jr., you have to sort of ask the question, well, what's his secret, sacred, sexual self? And what is her secret, sacred, sexual self? Because both of these individuals are in their 50s and they're mature individuals. Now, the young man, he's a consenting adult. You know, to my knowledge, there's no legal ramifications involved here. He was a consensual partner in this whole rather sordid affair and, well, you know, decided to leave it, and I'm sure we'll have one heck of a book deal and business opportunity because of all of the stuff associated with it. But again, if the argument against a traditional Christian sexual ethic is that it's unnatural and it's overly aspirational or it's unhealthy, one must begin to ask the question, well, what is a natural sexual ethic? And I don't think if you look at the Bible, there's any question about the Bible certainly understands something about that men are not naturally monogamous, at least to the degree or probably more so than women, and women look for other things, but individual experience might matter. So Jerry Falwell Jr. couldn't live up to the very demanding, aspirational Christian sexual ethic, and neither could his wife. And because the institutional context, because of the religious context and the social context, they could not live up to it, and they failed it. And so as a figurehead, he was asked to resign. But is this a story of, oh, what a terrible sexual ethic? Or is this a story that Jerry Falwell Jr. is the victim? He's a kink who has been bullied into this and had to keep his true sexual nature in the closet he likes to watch. Or perhaps he's gender fluid and, you know, was he watching his wife or was he watching the dude? Maybe he's fluid, maybe he's queer, and maybe his queerness has been repressed. And so he's the victim of this. This, if you want to work this way, is perhaps an example of internalized oppression. Well, what does that mean? Well, there's been tremendous pressure on him to conform from when he was very young. He's the son of a very prominent man for whom all of this kind of thing would have been denounced. And in a sense now his true self is exposed, but he continues to be repressed by the community. And even the $10 million severance package looks like some kind of subconscious do not disclose. And in a sense, someone would say, well, the $10 million severance package is more oppressive since. And some of you would say, please oppress me with $10 million. So in the anti-woke tribe, they might snicker, but there's some truth to this. That, well, everybody experiences certain, let's call them natural, because they seem to come up from our being, certain natural sexual inclinations and how to deal with them. Because, well, even with all the liberation of sexuality, it's very easy to see pressure on various people to conform to other archetypes or symbolic liturgies. It's not uncommon to find a story about a man who will say he's same-sex attracted but decided to marry a woman because he wanted to have children and a family, and so that's what he decided to do. So he decided to not express that same-sex attraction and, well, just put that out there and watch people go at the guy. So, well, is he liberated or not? Because everybody has an idea of what should happen, of what people should do. Norms emerge and people stick to them. And so you can have internalized oppression from many quarters. Now again, these are all consenting adults, and there's no small irony that the cultural political liberationist factions heap scorn on them. They should look at them as victims and say, oh, the horrible institution of Christianity and the Christian church that promotes this vision and punishes certain groups or rewards certain other groups for this repressive sexual ethic. That has little to do with the people themselves. Again, most of us don't know these people and quite frankly don't care. So then why does People magazine care? I doubt there's a lot of Liberty alum who write for People magazine. Maybe I'm wrong. Why does People magazine care? Why does the New York Post care? Why does the Washington Post care? Why does everyone across the culture war spectrum care about what all of these consenting adults are doing? They care because Jerry Falwell Jr. or an image of him plays a role in the public imaginary. A public imaginary that we are participating in. He is a symbol, a powerful symbol in a powerful set of a powerful symbolic world. You know, Jonathan Peugeot has that for his channel, and he's exactly right. But in many ways, I find the word symbol a little underwhelming for what I'm thinking about, because it is certainly symbolic, but it's also liturgical. And I know that some scholars have come up with new words such as dramaturgical and things like that. Why do we care about Mrs. Falwell and the pool boy and Jerry liking to watch? Was anybody harmed in this? Well, sort of the consenting adult idea means, well, if you're doing something in this and there's harm involved, you're responsible for your own harm. But are you really? And a lot of the whole internalized oppression perspective basically would say that none of them are responsible for the harm because this was all harm done to them by heteronormity and the patriarchy and colonialism and Christianity, and that's where all the harm comes from. And if they didn't have those oppressive standards upon them, they could all let their freak flag fly and walk away from this whole thing and. But that really doesn't work either, does it? Jerry Falwell Jr. and his wife have children, and apparently in the business deal, their sons, apparently I didn't go into the details of this whole thing, but what would Jerry Falwell Jr., how do Jerry Falwell Jr. and his wife, how do their children think about this? We say, well, the children's assumptions about what sexual morality is or isn't have all been formed by this Christianity too. So if you take away the formation, well, okay, fine. But here's the problem with human beings. Again, think about Brett Weinstein's point that you have this genetic track and then you have the cultural track. There's always going to be a cultural track. There's always going to be norms. There's always going to be a moral framework. None of us come to this without a first draft. And so when we sort of imaginatively think, well, if we would just get rid of these oppressive norms and standards, then everybody could pleasure themselves or pleasure each other and everything would be great. But first of all, that's a fiction because there's no getting rid of the present norms. Secondly, what we've seen by throwing off the shackles of traditional sexuality is that new moral norms happen in the new situation. And so my neighbors is an interracial couple. And so, she's a white woman and he's an African American man, and just read some of the woke stuff about the scorn that they heap on interracial couples. She's fetishizing the black man, and he's got racism internalized. And so you imagine that if you sort of throw off the shackles of a traditional Christian sexual ethic, that, well, suddenly things are going to be free. No, a new moralism is going to wade in, and pretty soon you're going to be deconstructing and throwing off those shackles as well. And so at some point you're going to have to ask yourself, where and with what tools are you going to construct your new moral ethic? Because people will have moral preferences, moral feelings, moral intuitions, and as these things get played out in community and they sort of get pulled up into the heavenlies and worked out communally, that's where these narrative, these liturgies, these symbolic identities, all of this stuff forms. And this is why we care about stories like this, even though none of us know any of these people personally. Now, truth is, I like Jerry better now than ever. And you might say, well, why should that be? Because, well, I've got a higher resolution picture of him. And again, I don't know. Is this man weak? Is he henpecked by his domineering wife? Maybe. He certainly loves her. It's a weird love, but he certainly loves her. He certainly cares for her. He's certainly committed to the relationship. And in some ways, in a deep level. Now, I don't think that says that they were doing the right thing, but I still don't know him. I'm not saying he shouldn't have stepped down. And I'm not saying that the Liberty University Board of Trustees should have done the wrong thing. Part of me feels the same way about Jordan Peterson and his drug issue, because again, I know a lot of people who didn't like Jordan Peterson then suddenly heap scorn. There's a dynamic that happens with hypocrisy. And, what was his name? Shelby Steele wrote a terrific book, taught me a lot about hypocrisy. And of course, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount and in Jesus' ministry, he makes a lot of hypocrisy. Jerry Falwell Jr. has now in some ways been shown to be a hypocrite. He participated in an institution that promoted a sexual ethic he could not live up to. He was exposed, and the $10 million severance, it's kind of hard-pressed to say he's disciplined. He's publicly shamed. He's lost status. But part of me likes him better for this. Why? I may not care for his politics. If I were his pastor, I would probably have some talks with him and his wife and talk to them about what's really going on here. And probably advise some counseling and suggest that this arrangement with the pool boy was doomed from the start and was going to bring a lot of misery to you and your family. Yes, you have failed to live up to the community standard, which is an aspirational standard, a demanding standard. Many common people meet it and I think are blessed by it. Sometimes standards like that also require sacrifice, and sacrifices are made in the aspiring to try to reach the standard. As a pastor, I see that all the time. People in difficult marriages may be married to someone who is a long-term marriage and someone develops Alzheimer's or somehow disabled in a long-term situation, and the other spouse suffers because their marriage isn't the kind of thing that it should be. And other people come around and say, so what if you have an affair? They barely recognize your face. What's the harm? And sometimes people do. Many times they don't, because they say, I understand, but I participate in this standard because I believe in this standard. And by actually participating in this standard symbolically, whether or not anybody knows about it or just a few people know about it, or maybe even my kids know it, it inspires them and it strengthens the community. And I believe that standard even in competitions with all sorts of other standards that have been practiced or promoted for years to come. I believe that standard is the best standard. And even if high status prominent people can't live up to it, or can't live up to it all the time, we as a community continue to promote the standard and say, this is what we'd like to hold each other accountable to. And so when individuals fail to meet it, read Galatians 6. We try to restore them with gentleness, lest we ourselves fall into sin. And I know many would like to say, well, let's get rid of the standard. And I say, please show me the standard you're going to replace it with. You might complain about the standard, and fair enough. It's a demanding high standard, but there are values and good things for that standard that spread out to the multifaceted aspects of that standard that every marriage actually embodies. And now when many people quietly fail the standard, and again, as a pastor, I understand this. It happens, well, just look at the study. Half of all marriages, there's a degree of infidelity. Now, in Christian marriages, the numbers are less, but it's still not uncommon. And many of the people are not high status people, and so you don't hear about it. And this is why communities hold their leaders to higher standards. And when something like this happens, he rightfully steps down. That's appropriate. But he's not hung or shot. In fact, pastorally, the church community comes around them and says, Mr. and Mrs., you failed. There's probably lots more behind this than any of us know for each one of the people. Do you still want to try and live according to that standard? Probably both of them would say yes. I don't know. Probably both of them would say yes. And so then you start in a process of saying, let's work towards it. Christian counselors come into play, pastors come into play, friends come into play. Because what happened to these people, I wouldn't wish on anyone. What has happened to Jordan Peterson, I wouldn't wish on anyone. As a pastor, you see the wreckage of what happens, and you say, if you just get rid of the standard, then you don't have the wreckage. I see lots of people who don't have the standards, and quite frankly, they have similar kinds of wreckage or other kinds of wreckages. I haven't seen another standard that works better, so please write it in the comment section if you have one. And you say, no, it would take a lot of words. And I'd say, yeah, that's part of the problem with these other standards, because if you really love them is not a good standard. It doesn't actually move out into the business aspects or the companionship aspects or the commitment aspects or all the other aspects that Christian marriage aspires to live up to. So frankly, I like Jerry better now. Having a demanding ethic means you will fail often. And Christian men do, and they struggle with it. And who of us knows the truth about the situation between the three of them? And again, my heart goes out to them because the details of their private life are now splashed. And if Jerry and the missus could have kept it between them, they could have kept it between them. And now their children know, and now their friends know, and everybody's awkward and uncomfortable. But of course it was bound to happen. This young man, he doesn't want to be a boy toy. He wants to grow up to have a mature, committed relationship. Maybe he doesn't. I don't know. But that's what I would wish for him. And his future wife or partner, they're going to have to live with this. Oh, you married that guy. Do even the players in this sad little drama know the truth about themselves? And again, this is where let's give the let's call it critical sexual theory. Let's give them their due in this. That for many of us, the package, let's say the first draft of sexuality that we experience, is it constructed by our family of origin? Yes. Is there a genetic component? Yes. There's a lot that goes into it. Yes. Does their long marriage and their sexual experience between husband and wife factor into this? Probably. Do their pre-marriage or even childhood sexual experiences factor into this? Probably. I mean, this is the sort of thing that we've learned because of psychology for years now, and we know it. And so I'd rather not get into some sort of Gnostic, secret, sacred, sexual self and start playing those games, because I don't think, number one, those games don't really honor the kinds of things that we've learned in psychology over the last 100 years, nor do I think they actually work in terms of a community aspiring towards a demanding sexual ethic. You say, well, our sexual ethic shouldn't be so demanding. Really? Because when I look at the kinds of things people hope for one another, people have demanding desires for one another generally. What do you want in a lifelong partner with whom you're connected with respect to money, and with respect to children, and with respect to family, and with respect to friendship? When you start putting all of those things together, the matrices of those things, it will make things demanding. And if you know that Uncle Larry likes to play around, or Aunt Janine likes to swing both ways, or that, does that really make Thanksgiving situations better? I remember talking to some friends who had pretty significant sexual histories that they brought into their marriage, and they were talking, they didn't have any children yet, and they're talking about how they're going to raise their children with respect to this. And, would you tell your children that they shouldn't have premarital sex? Oh, they felt that the broad sexual experiences that both of them had brought into their marriage had made them better people. Okay, congratulations. And then I asked him, do you think that, does the broad sexual history that the other person had, how is that factored into you? Are there certain people in your spouse's past that you don't want them to make contact with? And when Facebook emerges, if they do make contact with them, how do you feel about that? How many people have had, found somebody on Facebook and their current relationship isn't going well, and so yada, yada, yada. It's complex, people. The reason we have such a demanding sexual ethic is that it's messy and it's complex and it goes off into all these different directions. And now a young person probably doesn't know this because they're young, and in many ways affording a demanding sexual ethic that makes their life less complex later on is what cultures and these symbolic, liturgical, dramatic imaginaries are for. Because we want to bless the youth with wisdom. Does he love his wife so much that he would do this degrading thing? Now, maybe he found it degrading, maybe he didn't. We don't know. He probably doesn't know, because if you'd sit down and talk with him through it and if you've ever sat down, and of course therapists know this, but if you ever sat down and started working with people through these things, boy, it gets complex fast. And it's messy fast. Does he have repressed desires not in line with Christianity high standards? Doesn't everybody? That's what a demanding sexual ethic is. We are all broken. We all have political ideas. Let's be generous with each other about political ideas. We all have expectations that we have on each other. Let's be generous with each other with respect to those expectations. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have high communal standards. How can you keep both of those things together? We're debating whether our embraced preferences are aligned or not. Well, if you don't have an embraced symbolic, sexual, ethical imaginary, how do you negotiate between these things? And the negotiations get more complex as we get older, as you add shared property, as you add children, as you add years of familial experiences and relationships. We're all broken. We're all trapped by sin. And part of the sin comes into some of this stuff. What do I mean by sin? It's missing the mark. And again, having an aspirational goal up there and out there that says, I don't want to have anything that I'm ashamed of. You probably won't hit that goal. I don't want to have anything that I can't bring to my God and say, forgive me. I don't want to do the kinds of things that are going to create baggage in my marriage or in my children's lives or in my family networks. I don't want to do those things. And yeah, we're all filled with lots of other desires and appetites and drives, many of which we can't fully figure out. But having a demanding ethic affords you the opportunity to try to live up to it better than having no ethic at all. So we're all trapped by sin and we all fall short. And the first draft that all of us inherit is broken. We're all deceived at one level or another. And sometimes it's willful. That's what human beings are, and that's what we do. I think this might be Jerry Falwell Jr.'s one of his most important Christian moments in his life. Okay, you've been publicly shamed, hated by both sides, exposed. Blessed are you. Blessed are you. What do you mean, blessed? Well, guess what? The cover's been ripped off the whole sordid affair, 6 or 8 years of it. You go to church, Jerry? Probably going to have you and your wife are going to have a conversation with the pastor. And my bet is that there's brokenness in the relationship. And there's brokenness in each of them. And, well, he got the $10 million and they're tremendously wealthy people, so they're not going to worry about money. But when people see them, do they know? What do they know? What do they think? Falwell and his wife have to live with that, and the pool boy for the rest of their lives, probably. That's the story that gets dragged around. And so in many ways, maybe they'll take the opportunity to find a bottom here and to say, how can God work with something like this? When you've been exposed as a sinner. And in some ways, when Peter weeps bitterly after denying his Lord, there's a moment that God moves in and says, okay, Peter, you had a Messiah complex for your master. And it's now been ripped to shreds. And you thought that you were so strong, and you thought you could live up to this aspirational image of someone who would go into the teeth of opposing forces, and you caved. Jesus, in a sense, betrayed that image when he told you to put your sword away, and he healed the man that you struck with the sword. And then you crumble before the fire of a slave girl and deny him, and you go off and you weep bitterly. And then when after the resurrection and you're out there fishing, he calls you in and he says, Peter, feed my lambs. And you don't even want to look him in the eye, and he asks you 3 times. Well, what's he doing? He's restoring you. He is building in you the kind of Christianity that is not mere legalism. Because legalism says, I'm going to hit this standard. And I say, yes, hit that standard. But you'll fail other standards, because Christianity, we have high aspirational standards of sexuality. But that it doesn't end there. Of loving one another, of laying down our lives for each other. And we fail those standards. You know, one of the things that's happened politically lately is with all of the protests. And even in my own congregation, if you go back to my first conversation with Jonathan Peugeot, he wanted to talk about my, how I am liturgically. And I said, I'm a mess, Jonathan. I'm a mess. I was raised a Protestant, and our Dutch Reformed and the African American got all mashed up, and then the seeker movement came. But one of the things I decided to do when I saw people taking a knee in the streets, confessing their sins, as I thought, we need to make this more prominent in our church. And of course, I think the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox have done better on maintaining that, but Protestants haven't lately. So every week in our worship services, and I haven't tinkered with liturgy because I think liturgy is the work of the people, so I treat it very communally in my church. But every week we have a moment in our service where bow your heads, confess your sins. We have these high aspirational standards that, well, maybe you've met the sexual standard, maybe you've met the money standard, but there's a standard out there that you haven't met. And so church should have an aspect that's like AA, where we come together, and you know what? Peter's, in a sense, one of his most important in Christian moments was when he failed his Lord and yet didn't take his life. When you don't have to, when you don't have to carry the weight of his hypocrisy anymore because you've been exposed. When you can truly sing just as I am without one plea. When you are a sinner saved by grace and nothing more. When you are freely known and loved by God. When now, in a way that they've never been able to, Mr. and Mrs. Falwell can go to church and say, you know what? We are sinners. But the blood of my Lord is stronger still. That's why I like him now more than ever. And now maybe he won't live up to this either. That could very well happen. I don't know, and I don't need to know, and I don't care to know. That's between them and their God and their church. But a moment of failure like this, boy, God can do real things with something like this. Just like he did with Peter. Just like he's done countless times in so many lives I've known, where people will tell me, hey, I got married that first time and I cheated on her and I drank too much and I didn't use money and I ignored the kids and she had it and she divorced me. And then I slid down that hill and I hit bottom, and I finally said, God, it's a cliche, Jesus, take the wheel. Even in folk Christianity, there's sayings and there's memes, and yeah, they're trite, and yeah, they're kitschy, but there's often something to them, because you say, okay, Lord, maybe stop playing the games now. Maybe get real. Take off the hypocrisy, and new scabs of hypocrisy will grow. It's how we are. But this is a moment where something good can grow. And so I want that for them. I want that for them. The symbolic, liturgical drama, archetypal, we play these things all the time, and they're always in politics. This is sort of the next for the rest of the video. I don't really have the time to go into it, but this is all stuff that I've been sitting on and chewing on, and so often when I sit and chew on this stuff, it doesn't go away. Sometimes it goes away and then the video never gets made, but this one hasn't gone away because, well, what do I want? It's a symbolic, cultural, liturgical violation. He no longer has to play the role of president of a Christian college that has a high, demanding sexual norm. Okay. Now he'll get real with some things, and I hope he and his wife are blessed by them, and I hope their marriage is better for it, and I hope there can be some restoration in all of this. I don't hope for them that 2 or 3 years from now we hear that they're divorced, because that would make the news and people would scoff at it. Again, just because people can't live up to a standard, a high standard, doesn't mean it isn't a good standard. Debate the standard on its own merits, and if you've got a better one, post it in the comments section. But understand what standards are. And Christianity not only has a high and demanding standard, but it has processes for dealing with its people when they can't reach it. And in terms of the whole same-sex marriage debate, That's really where the debate should lie. Should the standard be altered? Or is the standard just hard, but still the important and necessary standard for the community? So how do you figure out the way this should work? So my prayers for the Falwells. I wish them well. I hope being out of the public eye will be a blessing. I hope good Christian people come around them. I hope they want to continue to, just, you don't know with people. Maybe they deconstruct. Maybe they take all their money and run. Maybe they start a reality show. Who knows? But maybe, and I have no reason to believe that they're not genuine Christian people. Maybe they go to a quiet corner and start working on their marriage and work on their Christian life and work on their relationships, and maybe 10, 15, 20 years from now, when there are no TV cameras, when there are no bloggers around, no newspapers, in some quiet corner, someplace, Mr. and Mrs. Falwell, covered in wrinkles, will look at each other with tears in their eyes and say, you know what? Yeah, we messed up. But God worked through this. And we now have goodness in our marriage that we never could have known before. And if we didn't fall so dramatically, so publicly, we never would have known that goodness. That's what I want for them. Will it happen? Can they have it? Can they have it? Yes. Will they have it? I don't know. But that's my prayer for them.